Well, welcome back, everybody, to the Chaplaincy on the Go podcast. I'm your host, Josh Zorhoff, and I am a teaching pastor and a therapist in the West Michigan area. And we are so grateful for our partnership with Care Portal. Care Portal is a technology platform that helps individuals who are at risk of going into the foster care system stay out of the foster care system by getting the support and helps that they need from local churches and individuals who want to support. And so we're thankful for their partnership, and I'm excited for the conversation today. We have the Deputy Director of Labor with us, Sean Egan. Sean, we are so grateful that you'd be with us. Welcome to the podcast.
Thanks so much for having me. As you know, just happy to be talking about this issue and bringing more awareness to people. So I really appreciate the work that you do to make that happen.
Thank you. Sean and I actually had a chance to talk at a conference together. We were at the conference talking about suicide and mental health in the construction industry. And as you know, in our last episode, we talked a little bit about mental health in the industry. But Sean, I'm really interested on what you have to say about some of the things that you're seeing from the Department of Labor and some of the things that you've been involved in really for the last few years engaging in mental health.
Yeah, sure. Love to, Josh. So I think to be relatively brief, I think both of us are struggled to be brief, but I would do my best. But a couple of years ago, our governor talked about mental health during her State of the State. She was talking about community mental health. As the Department of Labor, though, so coming out of the pandemic, we wanted to focus in on workplaces. So we had a work group that had psychiatrists, psychologists, organizational psychologists, big business, small business, labor, and you name it. We spent a couple of months just diving into data, and we really honed in on some real challenges in the workplace, the concepts of chronic stress and the stress response. And since then, we had 9 recommendations from the group. We've been trying to implement those, which includes a resource hub, a learning center, monthly webinars that we do. And we're really focused in the workplace. What's going on in our workplaces? How do we work? And what impact is that having on people? And how do we continue to make work better for all of us as human beings?
So what have you found to be the kind of catalyst, you said, coming out of COVID, all of that, to where we are now? And talk to us a little bit about what are you seeing in the workforce and how is mental health playing a factor in all of that?
Yeah, we saw the pandemic, no surprise to anybody listening, really exacerbated mental health issues for all of us across the country. I think the most insightful and impactful thing that I learned during all of this work is how stress works in our brain. And as a former electrician, I'm still an electrician, I just don't do electrical work currently. The concept of how we're wired made a lot of sense to me. And I didn't know this, and I don't think a lot of people do know it. So I love talking to everybody about it, and construction workers in particular. And just an important note, our work is really focused on every workplace, but we're honing in on construction because there's such a specific challenge related to male-dominated industries and mental health, as well as suicide. And as I'm sure Josh has mentioned before, the suicide rate in construction is much higher than every other industry. So we really want to have a focus on that. But this concept of stress really hammered home with me, and it kind of made me recognize different feelings that I had. So I think, in our brain, we have these different parts, and Josh can explain it much better than I can, but this little amygdala controls our stress response completely. And we all respond to stress the same exact way. So once it activates, we go into fight, flight, or freeze, and it shuts down or disengages our logic center. So we're no longer thinking rationally. And when that becomes pervasive, when that stress is long lasting, we call it chronic or toxic stress. Those can mean different things, but largely they're interchangeable now, the way that people talk about it. The most common outcome of chronic stress is anxiety and depression. So when I think about what's going on for people out there and sort of how stressful our lives are, Surgeon General just said that 40% of parents are way overstressed. They're chronically stressed, and the most common outcome for them is going to be anxiety and depression, along with physical health challenges, as well as other potential addictions, you name it. Because if we don't feel good, we're going to find out how to make ourselves feel good. And oftentimes we're going to turn to things that aren't good for us to help us do that. So it really helps to talk to people and say, hey, there's nothing wrong with you. This is how your brain responds to stress. And once that stress response is activated, you are thinking emotionally instead of rationally. You're not logical anymore. You're going to make rash decisions. And until that stress response is deactivated, we're going to have real challenges. So what we saw during the pandemic is CDC every year does this survey of households, and they ask people if they have symptoms of anxiety and depression. And before the pandemic, about 11% said yes. And then about midway into the pandemic, we were over 40% responding that they had symptoms of anxiety and depression. And that is trending back down, but we're still around in 2023, about a third of our country, adults are saying that they have symptoms of anxiety and depression. And think about the pandemic as a chronically stressful situation. And that's kind of what happens. And what we see and talk about a lot is that it's actually much higher for younger people. So about 50% of those folks that are 18 to 24 are reporting that they have these symptoms of anxiety and of depression. So right as they're entering the workforce, their logic center's not fully engaged. They're struggling with all of the things that anxiety and depression do, that I would defer to Josh on kind of how debilitating those conditions can be. And we have to make sure we're thinking about how work works to support them and make sure that they can function. And there's a lot of things that contribute in our workplaces to chronic stress or challenges mentally. And that includes things like excessive overtime, short staffing, too much work, too short of deadlines. A lot of things in our workplaces actually contribute to these feelings that we're having.
Wow. It's interesting that you bring up the age demographic of the 18 to 25, that college/career group that's just coming out of high school. The week that we did the conference, so that was mid-September, I had 3 phone calls from 3 different individuals, age 18 to 25, like right in that demographic, all struggling with anxiety and depression. Every single one. In fact, one of them was alerted to me by a foreman on the job site who said, "Hey, I think you should probably talk to somebody." And it stuck in my mind partly because I'd heard you share that statistic. I'd seen some of that research as well. Why do you think it is that 18 to 25, and I'd maybe even push it a little bit younger, why is it that we're seeing individuals who are in high school and up to early college or career, why is it so much stronger for them, do you think?
Yeah, I think we could probably both. We're a little bit older. I think both of us could probably talk for days about the impact of social media. In fact, I just saw a TED Talk recently where somebody actually said out loud that they blame Mark Zuckerberg in particular for all of the challenge we're seeing with young people right now because of the connectivity. Wow. I wonder sometimes, though, Josh, about how much of it is new versus how much of it is we're just more ready to talk about it now. I think we see more younger generations talking about it a lot. Social pressures that I saw for my own kids were much different than what I dealt with. I think similar, you had bullying, you had body image issues, you had teasing, you had different things, right? But we didn't have it 24 hours a day, 7 days a week through social media. So I think that's causing a real challenge. Also, a sense of hopelessness. I think for all of us, when you think about things like global warming and the wars that are going on and all of the divisive politics we're dealing with, it's pretty easy to lose hope that there's a brighter day tomorrow. And then the third thing is, functionally, it is much more difficult now to get out of the house. I think when I grew up, it was sort of, you knew when you were 18, you were out of the house. And theoretically, you could find a relatively good job and you could find relatively affordable housing and cars. And I don't know how you feel, Josh, but just looking at what my own kids are experiencing, those things are much more difficult to even come by. My daughter is doing very well, and she's at a spot where she's thinking like 5 years from now she might be able to buy a house. Like, she can't even really think about doing it right now. Now, I know it wasn't easy for us, so I don't want to suggest that like we had it way better, but it was multiples of differences between what the average salary was versus a house and a car to what it is right now. So I think there's a lot of those challenges that way. But a big part of it, too, is just the constant connectivity and negativity that we get from 24 hours news cycles, from social media, just constantly in our face about how terrible things are. Even though I think if we step back and look at what's going on in our own space, most of it is positive. We have certainly very difficult family dynamics. You know, grandma's getting old and, you know, maybe needs some help. A child is sick. That is terrible. Like, we have those things happen in our lives, but generally day to day, everything around you is positive and people are positive and you have support networks. I do think too, and I would wonder your opinion on this too, Josh, that as society's gotten bigger, as population has gotten bigger, we think about our side of the world, the west side of Michigan. I mean, there's a couple million people over here, right? And the more people, you actually lose connectivity. So we're not as, our family dynamics are more spread out, our support networks are more spread out. And I don't feel like we have the actual real personal connections that we have anymore that we used to have. And also, I think when we talk about construction in particular, one of the things I talk about when I say young people are about half are saying they have symptoms like have anxiety and depression. But when you come into an apprenticeship program, most of the employers aren't really thinking about that. So they have sort of that traditional macho, if you fail a test, you're fired. If you miss work, you're fired. If you do this, that, or the other, you're in trouble. We don't really have a supportive culture in construction. We have more of a penalizing culture in construction where failure is looked at more strongly than success. And we really need to turn that around so that we're building stronger people and not just kind of weeding out everybody except for the very few that somehow or another just make it through that challenge.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, let me share a thought, based on to your point a little bit of the connection problem. I think you're right. I know that overwhelmingly, and the US came out with a study last year to say this as well, that 50% of Americans are lonely. 1 out of 2, they say. And so if you don't feel lonely, just ask somebody else and they'll tell you they do. And I think that there is a connection between loneliness, isolation, and the mental health situations that we're seeing. One, the definition of loneliness really is the feeling of being someone who used to have friends. Like, we all know what it's like to have someone who's close to us. Those of us who feel lonely don't feel connected to the same degree. And I know that for me, in my work as a counselor, I've seen individuals who do in fact feel lonely. They don't know how to really define it. They don't know how to say it out loud. But when I ask them, hey, are you lonely? They'll say, yes, I am. And do you have people to talk to? Because sometimes just having someone to talk to about a bad day, or someone who in your life is kind to you, is enough to take some of the pressure off. I do feel like with especially the younger generation, as we look at that middle school up to high school, post high school, college career, that 10-year gap is probably the most difficult as far as navigating relationships. Right around middle school is when people start to fracture in childhood friendships and then form new friendships. And middle school is profoundly hard right now to find friends. It just is, because of social media and some of the other elements, but kids don't know how to talk to each other the same way anymore. And then you move from that, and then you move into high school where pressures are higher. And then you get into post-college career, and you're right, you may not have the 3 or 4 friends that you need to get the social capital, for lack of a better term, self-actualization or growth. And so I do think that there is a huge part of that. And I think that is part of the reason why there is such a misunderstanding, because I feel like when I talk to individuals who are my age or older, there is this negative stigma on millennials or Gen Z or whatever group that they just don't get it. They just need to toughen up a little bit more like we did. And I talked to a foreman 2 weeks ago who called me about an individual on his job site, age 18, depressed, crying on the job. These are skilled trade workers. And he said, I come from the generation of suck it up and deal. And I said, how's that working for you? And he said, not great, because I don't understand what is going on here. And I really feel like it's hard because foremen don't know how to be friends necessarily, and they can't be a friend to the people that they are working with. But there is a need for a level of understanding and compassion that has to be present if you want to see it change.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. I think one of the things I like to share is that not only my own experience of having gone through an apprenticeship and been in the trades and all that kind of stuff, but just kind of reinforcing that really, when you say your age or older, both Josh and I are around 40, a little bit older for me, maybe a little closer for you. But the reality is, for all of us, that sort of suck it up and deal with it wasn't the correct way to do it. And we can't really expect the next generation is actually teaching us. They're not hurting us about how to be more open and have these discussions. And certainly ready, willing, and able to accept accountability. I do want to add just one skosh that I try to remember in my own life. I think it's really important to always remember, too, that the frontal lobe for a human being is not fully developed until you're about 26 years old. So as adult or smart and committed as our young people seem, they're not done cooking. So when you think about the challenges that we're dealing with the anxiety and depression and being logical and rational, they're not really there. I struggle. Even we have a 4-year-old grandson, very communicative, very wonderful, and you kind of lose track sometimes of this is a 4-year-old, right? Like, so they don't understand things that we understand, and the same is true for teenagers, for middle school. Like, I mean, it really seems like they're full functioning humans, but we can't lose sight of that. They're not fully developed yet, and that logic center is not fully cooked, and it's going to take quite a bit longer to get there. So I think it exacerbates. So when we add that chronic stress in there to someone who's 18, 19, 20 years old, they don't have a fully developed logic center that can kind of extrapolate all that information in the same way that Josh and I can. We think we're fully cooked. We may not be, but we're in a different spot in our lives. So I always try to keep that in mind too, because young people are so functional, you just lose sight of that. And I think moving into that sort of that foreman mentality of, I had to suck it up, that is a real learning opportunity for foremen, for older people to recognize that millennials, Gen Z will work, can work, do work. Frankly, they're smarter than us on an IQ scale. And we just have to change some of our behaviors to recognize the changes of the culture that are coming into play. And it's not a change in work ethic, it's a change in the culture of work. So if we focus in on that, we can really build more supportive workplaces that actually increase productivity while increasing the well-being of every person on that job. So I'm pretty excited about where we're going. And I think one thing that a tradesperson told me that I thought was really insightful is this concept, one of those discussions, this concept of millennials don't want to work. And he said, no, they want to work. They just never had trade class in high school. They just never had exposure to the shovel. They just, so you're really starting from a more foundational level of teaching than what you may have been used to about 20 years ago, when a lot of kids showed up with some of those skills in hand. Now you're really starting from scratch, which is good in some ways. Always remind everybody, bad habits actually are learned faster than good habits. So we want to avoid those bad habits, which includes teaching people the wrong way to deal with stress. I think coming from the construction industry, I know, Josh, you and I have talked about it, is alcohol use is pervasive in the construction industry. And, I think some people say, sometimes is okay. I think science has told us that, frankly, alcohol ever is not good for you. But if that's your thing and you can maintain control of it, whatever, as long however it goes. But what we see in construction is a propensity for abuse, because people are going to start dealing with that stress. They're going to find ways to feel better, and that's going to be one of the tools that they're going to use. So that's one of the cultures we'll have to change in construction as we continue to develop the industry.
There's so much to unpack in what you said. I do want to reiterate, especially because we have a lot of parents who listen to the podcast. We have a lot of business owners who listen to the podcast. The prefrontal lobe formation conversation is so important. If you have an individual who is under the age of 25 that you are working with in whatever capacity, as a parent, as a boss, as a friend, when you ask them the question, what were you thinking? There is a 50% chance that when they say, I don't know, they really don't know. And that's because of that balance between the prefrontal lobe and the limbic system. The limbic system is the doing or the reacting part of the brain. And if people are under stress or they're suffering from depression or anxiety, they are going to react far more than they are think. And so asking questions like, wow, I wonder why I'm so stressed out right now, or why do I feel the way that I feel, or how could I approach this differently, or what could I do to maybe critically work through this situation, or what are some coping strategies that I can employ? Those are all parts of the prefrontal cortex that you need And if that's not fully formed, it's not that they can't access that. They just can't access it in the moment the same way. And we have this with children. In fact, I think it's easier for us to do it with children. You will know if your teenager is non-responsive to you if you keep asking questions and they keep shutting down. The best thing to do is to give them some space to calm down so you can have a conversation afterwards. Well, it's no different on the job site. If you're working with someone who's 18 to 25 and they're getting more and more frustrated and you feel like you're yelling louder and louder and you're throwing things and all of a sudden they start shrinking back, guess what? Nothing you say is getting into them at the moment. It's just not, no matter how hard you try. And so I do think that's probably, again, one of the cultures that needs to shift of like taking space for a timeout before you have a conversation. First of all, you probably need a timeout if you're an upset foreman or you are a ticked off parent, but also taking some time to give them the dignity of a chance to maybe regulate a little bit. And the alcohol thing, I read a report a year ago that said right now in the US, deaths of despair are higher than deaths by car accident. And what they're finding is that even if it's not classified as suicide, what they're finding is people who are drinking to obsess and then dying as a result of it, not necessarily because of an overdose of alcohol, but their bodies are shutting down, are profoundly higher since the pandemic. And I'm curious, Sean, because I think in Michigan, Beer City, USA, in March of 2020, alcohol sales went up by 300%. And I don't think they've gone back down. I haven't seen any research to suggest that there has been a decrease in alcohol sales. And I don't know if you have seen that or what you're finding.
Not in research, but anecdotally, I do have a brief update, which I think is probably pretty good news in some ways, is that from sort of establishment level sales, we know restaurants are struggling. That we all went to take out food and everything. That really hasn't changed. What we've also seen, though, is that younger people are not drinking as much as older people. So there's been what looks like, data-wise, don't have it yet, but what looks like is happening is that people our age and older are continuing to use alcohol, and then younger people are not. They're actually choosing different things. I think, frankly, we can talk about this on a different podcast, but cannabis becoming legalized. I think people are going to find their thing. So don't assume that doesn't mean they're not doing something, but they're starting to choose different things to use. But I think you're right on the money that because I do want to go back, though, because we talked about like younger people in their frontal lobe not fully developed. When somebody gets into that chronic stress and that amygdala is activated, and that frontal lobe is going to be very similar to what you're used to with the 18 to 25-year-old or even younger, where they might not likely know why they did something that they did. And that, as a workplace safety concern, that's very scary. And it also makes people more impulsive. So when we think about young people being impulsive, when you're in that chronic stress moment, when that logic center is not fully engaged, people are going to be more impulsive. So when we talk about died by suicide, often, Josh, I'll defer to your expertise on this, but often it's an impulse decision. It's people plan, they'll kind of make a plan, so you're going to listen for those things, but the actual moment is an impulse decision. And you'll hear from survivors that they knew they were wrong as soon as they tried. And fortunately, they survived. But it was that impulse that kind of pushed them over the top. So we think about how it's sort of all connected there, that, to get to logical, rational, we need the logic center fully developed and engaged. And we lose that. The more stress we endure, the chronic stress, anxiety, and depression comes in, we start to lose the ability of our logic center to be leading us. And we start responding emotionally and impulsively to different situations that we're around.
Inadvertently, I forget when the law was changed or when the insurance companies started working this way, but when insurance rates started going down after 25, they didn't realize that they were working through a neurological framework. They just realized that there were less accidents after the age of 25. But now we come back and we see that research proves the reason why there are less accidents in driving when you're in your 20s or 25 or whatever It's because you have a fully formed prefrontal lobe and you are less likely to make a bad decision when you're driving. You're less likely to say things like, I can make it, or this would be a good idea, or I can get around this vehicle in just enough time. You actually have something in your brain says, I just don't know. And it's enough of a pause to keep you from making a really bad decision.
Yeah, and I think in the focusing in on the construction industry in particular, but you can really extrapolate this out to everybody. But we can talk, or we like to talk about. So, what is it about the industry? So, first of all, it's a male-dominated industry. We know that. We know that men are very unlikely to seek help. We know that as you get older, men are not very good at finding friends, so you become more isolated. We know that men are less likely to use therapy. So we have that challenge. So we got to break down the stigma, which I'd love to talk about for just a minute, in just a moment. The other piece, when we talk about it from the Department of Labor, it's in the workplace. So thinking about it's a higher hazard industry, so you're going to have some degree of stress just from that. As a former construction worker, I can tell you, and you've heard this, Josh, that you deal with financial insecurity. I mean, it's busy right now, but there's still ups and downs. There are hills and valleys. There could be short layoffs and long layoffs. So you're always thinking about that. I still live like I'm getting laid off next week, and it's been 20 years since I've been in the field. So it's weird, right?
Wow.
You develop these kind of mannerisms. Then you do get busy and you get excessive overtime. We know that excessive overtime hurts people's well-being. We know that night shifts hurt people's well-being. We know that excessive overtime and night shifts make people more likely to get injured on the job. So there's like all of these kind of things in that industry, which can be taken to others that we really want to be thinking about and talking about. And one of the things we talked about a lot at the conference was construction workers typically do not have paid time off. So if a worker does need to go see the therapist or go get support or just take a mental health day, they don't really have access to those. Now, I'll let Josh talk about the way he explains that on whether or not they're taking those days or not. But that's a real challenge out there. And I can tell you, the joke always was, I'd rather not feel good at work than lay on the couch for free. So people are going to come to work with the anxiety and depression from the chronic stress that they have, which means they're going to have brain fog and confusion and more likely to get hurt, maybe injure a coworker, probably not do things as well, definitely won't be as productive. I think before we wrap up today, however long we go, we really got to spend some time talking about doing less will make people more productive. So you can really improve your bottom line by thinking about how we do things a little bit differently. So I'll just pause for a moment and let you jump in there.
No, I'm so glad that you brought that up. I do think that there's a way for us to talk a little bit about destigma, or destigmatizing mental health in the workspace and things like taking a day. And I like the language of I need a day versus I need a mental health day, because nobody's going to call in and say, hey, to HR, I need a mental health day. They're just not going to say that, but they will say I need a day. And I think that feels accessible to me. I'm thinking about writing a small ebook on I need a day, just because I feel like that language is a little easier. But I will say this, especially if you are an employer, your employees, they are taking mental health days. They're just not telling you about it. They're lying to you about it. They're calling in sick when they're not sick. They're calling in when they're hungover, and they're too drunk or too hungover to come in, which is incidentally is a mental health day. It's just one that is a recovery from bad mental health care. Or they're just flat out saying they're sick when they're not, and they're not coming in. And even if they do come in, to your language as well, they're coming in, but they're not fully present. So there's absenteeism, which is when people are taking time off more than just their regular PTO. But then there's presenteeism, or quiet quitting is another word for it. And that's where they're showing up, but they're not giving you your best energies. I don't remember what the statistic is. I think it's accurate, though. If you take a day off, if you actually have a full day off and you are rested, your productivity increases by 60%. But if you try to power through and you do a week without taking a day off, you actually decrease productivity by 30%. And I see that as more people try to power through, their productivity actually decreases day by day. So I do think that there's a connection to all of that. And some of it you're not going to see in the bottom line necessarily, but you will see it overall because you're spending, if you're an owner and you're not giving the appropriate time off or your people aren't taking it, what you're going to have is you're going to have more money out the door and you're going to spend more money on burnout than you are actually on getting the job done without those burnout factors.
Yeah, absolutely. We talk in our report. Everybody can find it if they want. Michigan.gov/workplace mental health. We included information on sort of the invisible costs, we called it. So we know things like absenteeism, in particular, tardiness, use of benefits. Some of those are like employers will see those, but to your point, presenteeism is the one that doesn't really show up as much. You'll see that productivity is not as high as maybe you anticipated, but what you're not recognizing is the cause of that productivity being lower. And all of these folks within anxiety and depression, by and large, are going to come to work the vast majority of days in the work year. And I think in our report, one of them I mentioned to you, Josh, is Tufts University spent a long time kind of digging into this concept of presenteeism and identified like the 10 top most costly presenteeism losses. And for many of us, 9 out of 10 were like physical health ailments. So somebody with a bad lower back was the second, number 2 most expensive chronic condition in the workplace that reduced productivity. And we kind of understand that, right? That if somebody has a bad back and they're in construction industry in particular, we know that they're going to perform at a different level than somebody that's not dealing with that. And what Tufts found is that equated to about $42 per worker on the job. So you got 10 people, it's 42 times 10. And the way they got there was kind of identifying how much productivity I lost because of that condition, divided by my salary across all of the workers. But the number one condition they found was depression. And people in the workplace dealing with depression, because that logic center is not fully engaged, lose more than any other physical ailment that people are potentially having in the workplace. And I think in construction, we could say we know that the longer you're in the industry, the more likely you are to have physical ailments, right? I think as electricians, we always say your wrists, your hips, your lower back. By the time you're 60, those are going to be shot. And it's sad. But that's kind of what happens. With line workers, it's their shoulders because they're always over their head, right? They're going to get a replacement at some point. So we know that those things are going to happen. But depression itself, while it was like $42 for the lower back pain, was $109 per employee. That's how much less productive somebody can be when they're bringing that into the workplace. So if we're focusing on that kind of thing in our workplace, you can increase your bottom line, you can increase your productivity just by making the workplace a little bit more supportive. And that's why, to your point, Josh, that's why if you're reading those studies on this 4-day work week, which is actually a 32-hour work week with no cut in pay, that's why it is working, because productivity is actually at or above the same level as it was on the 5 days. And why workers can actually work less hours and make the same money is because they're getting that break from the chronic stress. They're getting that time to wind down. They're getting a little bit more breathing room. Might not work for all industries, but you get the point. The point is there's a way to do it better. Yeah. And we can reduce the amount of sort of depression in the workplace, or we can reduce the anxiety and depression. We're going to thwart and avoid some addiction issues. Now, we do know genetically some people are predisposed to addiction issues, but a large amount are not. And just because you're genetically predisposed does not mean you'll get there. But right. we can start breaking the connection to some addiction issues. We can increase productivity and frankly, just make people more functionally across their lives. And there's a lot of ways that we have to approach that. So in construction, male-dominated industries, we're talking breaking the stigma. Now, Josh and I are old enough to have grown up when you're a man and you got to be tough and guys don't cry and all that kind of stuff. And we got to get over that because that's not the way that it works. Now, one thing that came up in our report over and over again, and it's true in the data wherever you research it, if you just Google search it, is that the majority of people that could use help are not going to go get it. So part of that stigma, part of that's just humans that don't want to talk to another human about those types of things. So we have to attack that. So one of the things we're doing in Leo is we're approaching things from kind of a mindset of how do we give people the concepts of therapy without them having to go to therapy. So one we identified was man therapy, which is a very, very useful tool, came out of Colorado, but it's worldwide pretty much now. Kind of takes a joking tact to help guys kind of learn these concepts of chronic stress and depression and anxiety and loneliness and kind of feel more connected to it. And the research is showing that it's not only helping with suicide, potential suicides, it's helping men actually choose to go to therapy. Now, I've done therapy in my life, and I don't know how you feel about therapy, Josh, but I can tell you the most valuable and powerful thing for me with therapy is that the therapist can help you recognize when your perception is flawed, when your ideas are flawed, when your concepts are flawed, and help you find tools to correct those. Now, I went through that early on in my life, young family, all the pressures of life were piling on. Definitely got into those feelings of anxiety and depression. Was drinking too much. It's easy to get in the grip of alcohol. It's hard to get back out. Started seeing the therapist and kind of dealing with these kind of warped. I can tell you all, when you're kind of in the throes of anxiety and depression, a lot of your perceptions are really warped. And you start to view the world much differently. And you start to think, well, everybody's doing this and everybody's doing that. And I can't do this. And this is against me. And this is for me. Like it's these weird perceptions. And people like Josh and other therapists can help you get back to reality. And frankly, as long as you follow the steps and the guidance they kind of give you, it really helps you get back to at least neutral, to a positive point in your life where you can start building back. So I always tell my son, Josh, sorry, son, hope he doesn't listen, doesn't get mad at me, but I always told him when he was growing up, when you find yourself in the hole, the first thing you have to do is stop digging.
Yeah.
And the second thing, when you're dealing with this anxiety and depression, this addiction, these other feelings, the other thing is to find someone that can throw you the rope. And that's going to be the therapist that's going to help you get out of that hole. I probably should have said a ladder, but help you get out of that hole to make sure that you can do that. So one of the things we really want to do is teach people, like, this is brain science. This is how stress works. This is a response to stress. This is why you feel this way. And then we want to get to things like resilience, which I imagine we'll get into. Now, we talk just a short definition. I'll let Josh give a longer one, but resilience basically is kind of recognizing the stress and finding ways to lower your stress level. And I always say, I don't have to know where the stress is coming from, but I can tell that I'm having it. And I can start to do the things. For me, it's exercise. If I don't exercise long, I start getting that serotonin dip and I can feel crappy really, really fast. So I have to keep it with the exercise. And as I joke, if you say, hey, Sean, when's the last time you exercised? And I say it was 2 weeks ago, then I'm struggling. If it was a few days ago, then I'm okay. So I really have to keep that going. But resilience is recognizing the stress and finding. So you think about meditation, it could be prayer. It could be a lot of different things that help you kind of reduce that stress level. But the key that we talk about in the Department of Labor is it's a system focus, because I can learn to be more resilient. But if I keep going back to the stress, it doesn't matter if I'm more resilient. I'm just going to continue to have this chronic stress. So we really have to think about how we manage both of those. And there is an individual responsibility part of this, right? Now, I can't make you feel better. I can't make you feel happy. But people like Josh can give you the tools to get yourself to that spot. So we do need both. I don't want to say that we don't need resilience. We do need both, but we do want to think about what's causing the stress. The example I always use, because it's easy for everybody to imagine, is that if you're living in poverty, you are chronically stressed. And if we teach someone in poverty to be more resilient, but leave them in poverty, it doesn't really change the situation for them. It's not going to change the stress level that they're dealing with. And we do know in studies that people that live in poverty die younger. They age faster. They're more likely to have addiction issues. They're more likely to have financial independence and job security issues. And part of that's the stress that they're dealing with, because they're never breaking out of the chronically stressful mindset that they carry with them. So I think, really for men in particular, you got to start asking for help. And it's okay to ask for help. Now, it's a real challenge. Now, coming from the industry, I can tell you that you're not very likely to and I love that you said it, I need to take a day, is You're not going to tell anybody you have a problem. You're not going to tell your coworkers. Definitely not going to tell your boss, because then you're afraid you're going to get laid off. You're not going to tell HR. You may not even tell your significant other that you're having challenges. They're going to see it, but you might not talk to them about it. So we really got to get to where we can teach people how your brain works. We can get you connected to people like Josh and others that can help you deal with the work perceptions or get you back to reality somewhat. That's the way it worked for me anyway, and help you build a stronger piece there. And resilience is a part of the toolbox for that, for sure.
The resilience factor is pretty significant. I do know that only about 25% of individuals who go through chronic stress periods exhibit signs and symptoms of what is considered post-traumatic stress. 75% exhibit signs of post-traumatic growth. I think there's something inside the human condition that does say, hey, I can get through this, but sometimes I wonder the factor that helps people get through it is probably linked to another person saying, hey, you can get through this. You can do this. And as relationships, and I'm glad you brought it up, as men in particular get into their 40s and 50s, they don't make friends. They just don't. They've gone their whole life working. And the idea of having solid people that you can talk to aside from colleagues is pretty rare. I actually find that most relationships in the job, most friendships with the people you work with are probably for men stronger than relationships outside of it. That's why a lot of the work that I do in the chaplaincy is encouraging individuals to talk about it with their coworkers, even if they're joking, to just talk about it in a specific way, because I feel like there's going to be way more traction in the company. Like, that's why I want to see things like toolbox talks on anxiety and depression. Companies that are bringing in professionals to say, hey, we're going to talk about this just like we would talk about tying off when you're up in a boom, or making sure that you have the proper PPE, making sure that you talk about mental health in a way that isn't necessarily like man therapy. It can be a little comical, it can be a little joking, but you're actually talking about it and you're having legitimate conversations in the workplace. Because sometimes all you really need is to be able to say to somebody, you know what, like, I'm really stressed out and I'm struggling today. Like, it doesn't have to be any more. You don't have to get into the details. It could be about the job. It could be about your marriage. It could be about your kids. But just to say, I'm stressed out and I'm struggling today, or I feel frustrated today, can be enough to help at least acknowledge, I need to do something about this.
Yeah, and from the workplace safety side of me, we didn't say at the outset. So my primary job, I oversee my OSHA, workers' comp, wage and hour, the Bureau of Employment Relations. So I do all the sort of workplace focused stuff in workplace safety. When somebody tells you they're stressed out, brain fog, confusion, all that kind of stuff, you got to be mindful. And then just the stress what you're doing can add, especially in the industry. I always use your extreme heights, but that's going to add stress to people. But to get people to talk, I think is critical. We're all sharing the same experience. As individual as we think we are, most of human life is pretty much identical for all of us. So we can talk about and learn from each other on how to deal with different situations. And I do like what you said about building, that old, that which does not kill us only makes us stronger, right? So if we can approach things differently, we can get help to get the right mindset around different things that we're experiencing. These can be learning and growing experiences for us if we allow them to be learning and growing experiences for us, I think, and just a spot in time. That's something I've shared. It's been intrinsic for me my whole life that whatever it is just a spot in time. It's not going to be like this forever. And there is another side of this, and tomorrow is likely to be better, and tomorrow is likely to be better, right? So getting a little more positivity, I think some of us, just inherently have a little more optimism. I honestly am not one of those. I think from family traits, like old Irish adage, right? We can be a little bit dark and fatalistic at times. So there are definitely moments where I have to challenge my own perceptions on how things are going and recognizing that it's just a spot in time. So I think one of the challenges we have too is for anybody in the industries, any workplace, I don't care what workplace it is, if you're in a leadership role and you've been dealing with these issues, it's really critical that you start talking about it, because you're really going to set the tone for everybody else to start talking about it. Now, you don't have to share all the details, and you don't have to get into if you want to therapy or not, but just even telling people that you're stressed, or that these schedules getting crunched are causing you a lot of stress, like just making it okay to feel that way. Because I think a lot of times we get to leadership roles and we feel like we have to be big and strong, and we can't show any kind of downside. We can't show any kind of I'm losing the word off the top of my head, but we can't show any kind of failing. That's the tone you're going to set for everybody else, and it's not a realistic tone. It's not realistic for you. It's not realistic for anybody else. Yeah. So we really need you to start talking about these things that you're dealing with. And I've been trying, like I was today, to be more open. For just as an example, one thing we're doing in our department is getting leadership on these little short videos we can share to talk about how stressed they are, how they're dealing with the stress, if they're open to it, if they're using therapy, kind of different tools that they're using to deal with the stress that we all endure as a part of our work. And it's just critical that you get into that flow, because we need top to bottom, bottom to top. We need everybody to kind of get on board, and it's really going to be leadership that's going to set the tone for what the organization can be. I can tell you, one contractor from the east side over toward Bay City, Fisher Construction, good plug for him, several years ago had an employee die by suicide, and really got him thinking about how we operate, what's our culture, what are we doing, and made a lot of changes. But that's a big part of it, is getting those internal advocates to talk about the challenges that they've had, so that they can really create a more holistic approach to employee well-being across their company. And it's been just monumental, the change in retention.
Wow.
People seeking out his company to work for. They do it in the safety talks. That's one of our recommends too, Josh. I'm glad to hear you talk about it, is put it in your tailboards, your safety talks, your whatever it is that you're calling workplace safety. Just put it in there, because it is a part of workplace safety and health, and just kind of continue to grow that. So top to bottom, bottom to top, everybody's got to open up on kind of what's going on.
I love that. I'm curious your thoughts on this, because I've had, over the years, people have asked me, what's the best thing I can do for stress? What's helpful? And I always go back to it. It seems really simple, but just 2.5 to 3 minutes of deep breathing on a daily basis is probably one of the best, easiest ways to go about it. I had a gentleman come to see me a few years ago who had gone through some deep-seated family stuff. And he's like, I think I'm ready to talk about my family. I think I'm ready to talk about just everything that I went through. And he was like ready for therapy. And I said, cool, no problem. We're going to start by deep breathing. I'm going to teach you some skills. And so we did that for 45 minutes, and he had homework to come back and do that. And he came back 2 weeks later, and he was really frustrated with me when he left, because he essentially thought that I wasn't taking what he had gone through seriously. And he said, I was ready to talk about my family, and I was really irritated that you made me do breathing like that. Just, I could do that on my own. I said, well, yes, but you wouldn't, because we're talking about it here. I gave you a plan, held you accountable. But then he said this, he said, I was shocked at how much of a difference it made in my daily stress. And then I followed it up with, well, now do you want to talk about your family, or are you okay? Because the truth is, you might not need to talk about all of that stuff. You may have come in thinking, my family stuff is really my problem. And it also might be that you just needed a skill. You just needed a simple tool to utilize on a regular basis that would get you to a place where you didn't feel overwhelmed by stress, or it wasn't unmanageable for you. And so I'm curious, in that respect, what would it look like if we just invited companies of every size to start just doing deep breathing exercises before they start the day? I was at the Apple store earlier today, and before they opened, they had their whole rally party, and everybody was clapping as they came in, and all the enthusiasm. And I was just wondering, well, what would it look like if they just did 2 minutes of deep breathing before they started the day and brought people in?
Yeah, I would actually think it would be very powerful. I think all of us know that this concept of meditation is good, that it can be helpful. And if you Google it, you'll find all kinds of stuff. I would guess 80% of the people listening have tried meditation. And if you actually try kind of what you read, it's really, really hard. It's really, really hard to do meditation. And what Josh is talking about, 2 to 3 minutes of deep breathing, is meditation, right?
Yeah.
That is meditation. It's quieting and calming the mind. It's getting you back to using your logic center. One of the reasons this patient probably responded so well, because he could actually rationally start to think about the situations in his life in a deeper way. We are finally getting slowly to the concept of doing stretching before we start work.
Yes.
So we are finally getting to, and it's been proven to reduce injuries, to increase performance, to allow people to work longer and better and stronger. And, we saw it in different countries for a long time. And us Americans, because we're smart and silly, we thought it was silly and we weren't going to do it. I actually remember, if you're old enough, there was a movie in the 80s called Gung Ho, where a foreign automaker came to this country and they did stretching before the shift. And all of us Americans were like, this is stupid. And then we realized it's actually quite helpful. This deep breathing concept would be exactly the same. So if you're a company, if you're not doing stretching, start doing stretching. The guys would be a little resistant, the folks, not just the guys, but the folks might be a little resistant, but it's going to be good for them. And then bring in this concept of deep breathing. And part of it is just getting people to understand how effective it can be. And if you haven't done it, maybe as we close out, that would be your little guidance on how to do it. But that was one of the first things my therapist had me do, was deep breathing, because when you're kind of lost in the stress, it's hard to do that on your own. It's hard to really think like, oh, I got to stop and do some deep breathing to get myself to calm down. It's hard to really even focus on removing what you end up trying to focus on is, how do I get rid of the stressor, or what I think is the stressor, instead of lowering my stress response? And the first step really to what Josh gave his client is lower the stress response and then start dealing with the stress. So I think it would be wonderful. And if, like I said, if you're not doing stretching, start doing stretching, even if everybody is mad at you for having to do it. And then add in deep breathing. And then at some point, when you get that rolling, you can talk to folks about that. Hey, that is a form of meditation. You can use that all the time. When you're at home, you can go longer, you can go shorter. Sometimes I do it right when I go to bed, because I know, I'm feeling a certain way, and I just kind of take some time and do the visualization that goes along with it, right? The in and the out, and it'll really calm you down really, really quickly. And it's very, very helpful.
Yeah. I use a specific type of breathing these days, a breathing exercise. It's called box breathing. It was developed, actually, to my knowledge, it was actually developed in the Marine Corps by marksmen, and then they moved that on to sniper school. But it is, you visualize a box, and you start in one corner and you breathe in for 5 seconds, and then you move to the other corner and you hold for 5 seconds, and then you breathe out for 8 seconds as you make your way down the corner of the box. And then you're still for 5 seconds. And they train shooters to shoot in that still part, because that's when you are at your most restful, your most calm. And in the military, they call it staying up front, which is code for your prefrontal cortex. I say all of that because, it makes it sound a little manlier when you tell people that Navy SEALs, Marine Force Recon, and snipers use this box breathing. But the military has strongly adapted this. First responders, firefighters. In fact, I use box breathing on the app that I developed. And I showed a friend of mine he works in Grand Rapids for the fire department. And he saw the app and he was like, oh, box breathing. So he knew it right away and he recognized it. But box breathing essentially is breathing in for 5, holding for 5, out for 8 to 10, still for 8 to 10, or still for 5 to 8. So you and then you work your way around. And if you do 5 rotations of that box breathing, it will put you back in your prefrontal cortex. I think it takes less than 3 seconds for whatever stressor that you encounter to trigger blood flow from your prefrontal cortex to your limbic system. So in less than 3 seconds, you can be fully limbic. And that means you're reactive, you're not entering in, you've got that stressor has triggered you. It takes 90 seconds, almost 30 times longer, to move that blood flow back. And breathing is the best way to do it. So taking a deep breath in, holding, breathing out slowly, and then resting and just repeating and going around that box. I honestly feel like if companies were to do that, I think they would see immediate benefit. In fact, my wife's a first grade teacher, and when children do deep breathing before a test, they get 3% higher grades on their test just because they've done deep breathing. It has nothing to do with what they've studied. It has nothing to do with it. It's everything to do with them being calm and them being able to access that fuller critical part of their brain.
Yeah, gets them back to the front, right?
Back to the front.
Back to the front. I love that too. I love that you said military too, because I think about the military quite. If you think about an organization that has to deal with stress, it's the military, right? They're going to figure out how to do things. And you think about first responders, military, others, and why they drill all the time. Different situations, different scenarios, different whatever. And all of that is to deal with once their stress response activates. If the front is not working correctly, that person knows exactly what to do because their little hippocampus region is going to kick in where their stored memories are to know how to respond to that stressor. And then using deep breathing for those more critical roles like the sniper, or just to get yourself back to front. I love that. Back to front is going to be just key. So I think you're right on the money. We'll start to see improvements right away, and it actually would probably start loosening up people to engage with whether it's the educational part of how stress works or see people like Josh and get the support that they need because they'll better recognize that they're in the stress response.
Yeah. I'm so grateful for your time and just for the work that you're doing. I'm going to give you, if it's all right, I'm going to give you the last word here before we stop the recording. And so just what is it that you think owners, people, individuals need to hear in terms of this mental health conversation?
Yeah, I love it. It's not just an individual problem. So when we think about chronic stress and how the brain responds to stress, which is the way we're thinking about the workplace, I think when we start to think about mental health, we always really quickly go to there's something wrong with Sean. And the reality is it's broader than that. It's all tied together, sort of circle of life type stuff from the Lion King. But literally, we have to identify where the stressors are. We have to think about people in our workplaces as human beings and recognize that if they do get the stress response, it's going to cause challenges for the workplace and them, and start to think about how we do things more broadly or differently and put sort of the human back in the human resource side of the equation to recognize we're all wired the same way. We're all wired to respond to stress the same way. And that whatever that stress is, we have to identify and figure out how to manage it better. We can't always get rid of what is going to cause the stress, but we can manage it better and really think about it more holistically than just as an individual issue.
Sean, thank you so much. We're going to put the link to your study that the research stuff that you put out. We'll put that in the podcast notes. We'll get that from you. And yeah, we're just grateful for the work they're doing. So that's all we have for you now. We will talk with you later.